The Dunwich Horror and Others by H.P. Lovecraft. So The Dunwich Horror and Others was a short story compilation that Arkham House put together in 1963 is the date, I believe. But all of these stories were written in the 1920s and the 1930s, and I'll put a picture up here of the table of contents of that one. And I didn't have a copy of that book, but what I did have is The Best of H.P. Lovecraft by Del Rey Publishing. And so when I looked through this table of contents, and I'll put it up here, I realized it had every story but two of them, and I was able to find the other two online. So I read most of them through here, but I will say I have struggled. I've tried to read Lovecraft in the past. I've always kind of struggled getting into these stories. So a lot of the Cthulhu mythos-based stories I listened to on a YouTube channel called Horror Babble. And I gotta say, they did it really well. The guy has this English accent. He can pronounce all the terms that Lovecraft created. He puts some sound effects and a little bit of voice acting into it that really helped me get into it. And it's one of those rare circumstances where I feel like I enjoyed some of these stories more in audiobook than actually reading them. But I'm going to talk just briefly about my overall thoughts, then talk about some of the stories that I really liked, and then just kind of wrap up the video. So some things that surprised me here. I had a feeling that these were mostly horror, and I'd heard the term cosmic horror, but I was kind of surprised on how many science fiction elements were in some of these stories. And that was a pleasant surprise to me, and those were mostly the Cthulhu stories had some science fiction elements to them. There was plenty of occult and horror and some other things going on, but he talked about Einstein and planets and aliens and a lot of different things that I really didn't see coming. I was also surprised at how well he kind of built this mythos up. He had these fictionalized towns and colleges set in New England, and they seemed very believable. At first I thought maybe these were real places, and when I looked them up, I realized they weren't. He also talked about the Necronomicon and other works of occult text that I thought were possibly real until I looked them up and realized that he just made them up for this whole kind of universe he built in this Cthulhu universe. And then how he jumps in and out of this with these different stories and covers different elements and tries to describe kind of otherworldly things like even color and geometry and aliens and these kinds of things. And I was really surprised on how much I liked those and how they leaned into the science fiction. It was a little bit more than I thought. So overall, I'm really glad I read this collection, and let's just kind of get into some of the stories that I liked the most. So first I'm going to talk about some non-Cthulhu based stories that I liked. One of my favorites overall in this whole collection was Pickman's Model. And this was about a artist who painted these really crazy, horrific, gruesome creatures and scenes. And we have a narrator that gets kind of invited into his house, and his house is almost like used as a gallery. And as our narrator gets deeper and deeper into his house, the paintings kind of get more horrific. And then he ultimately gets to find and understand what gives this artist his inspiration to draw these things. And the story was great, but what really got me on this one was the writing. Now, Lovecraft definitely has a way with the English language, and it was almost like this horror poetry, and some of it was a little over the top, but it was so vivid how he described these scenes and these paintings, and it just really helped me envision them, and all the language he used for this was really good. This was one of the first stories in this collection that I read, and I was kind of afraid that the whole collection was going to be like this kind of over the top language, but this, in the end, this was kind of a standout to me. He has great language, and his writing is phenomenal, but this one was just set apart a little bit in that aspect, and in the end, it was definitely a standout for me. So then there was another one called The Outsider, and this was about an individual who was living underground, had never had any interaction with any other humans or anything. He finally crawls out of this pit that he had been living in, sees the sky for the first time, starts wandering around, and he stumbles across a house that had some humans in it. And it's just really interesting, the revelations that happen when he tries to interact with these humans and what he realizes he is, and what overall happens in the end of the story. I really enjoyed that one too. And then the other one that I really liked, it was in this collection of the best of, but it wasn't in the Dunwich Horror. So this is one that's, a little separate, but it was called The Silver Key. And this had a lot of metaphor in it, and I couldn't help but think this had to do with Lovecraft's life. I don't know a lot about Lovecraft. I'm no expert, but it's about this writer who, when he was younger, his grandfather gave him this key, and it was almost like a metaphor used for creativity. And he wrote, and then eventually he kind of lost this key. And he's at this point where he's kind of reflecting back on that, and he's trying to write again. And he talks a lot about the difference between art just for the sake of art, or art for money and trying to make a living at something like this. And there was just a lot of really neat passages. There was a little bit of like stream of consciousness in this one. And it definitely stood out as something unique and different in this collection. And I really enjoyed that one. So the rest of these I'm going to talk about are all Cthulhu mythos-based stories. And the first one I'll talk about is just The Call of Cthulhu. And this is probably, I would assume, one of his more popular ones. It's probably a good intro to the Cthulhu mythos, maybe. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not an expert. But you get to find out that a lot of these aliens, these creatures, it's linked with some occult and some ritual practices. There is some otherworldliness to it too, and it gives you a good probably starting point maybe to some of the other stories that come out later and get into some other aspects of this world. And you get a description of our man Cthulhu himself, and I found this picture. I believe this is what Lovecraft drew, is what he envisioned Cthulhu to be. And of course, we've seen some, I guess, some different artists' renditions since then, but just kind of interesting there. And then The Color Out of Space, this was about a meteorite that struck Earth, and it left this impact crater. And like the title suggests, it's a color that humans had never seen before. It was even hard for them to fathom or describe. And he attempts to describe how this would work, and then what this pit does, or this crater, to the surrounding area and to all the people that go investigate it. It was done really well. I really enjoyed that one too. And then The Dunwich Horror, that's the name of the compilation. I think this was another one of his more popular ones. And this was about a boy named Wilbur. He's kind of from this creepy family. The townsfolk kind of stay away from this family and this house. And he starts growing at an astronomical rate, and his grandfather gets him into the occult, and he goes seeking these occult texts like the Necronomicon. And then what he ends up kind of unleashing or bringing to this town, which ends up kind of terrorizing the town and everything. There's a pretty neat twist to the end of this one. And I think this is one that most people would probably read, or it was probably one of his more popular ones. Really enjoyed that one. Then there was The Haunterer in the Dark. This was about a man who, from his apartment, he could see this church and he's kind of drawn to it. All of the people that live in this town are kind of scared of this thing and don't go near it. But he gets drawn to it and he goes inside of it. And this is where Lovecraft gets into some of this geometry and how he links that into the Cthulhu mythos. And it's this otherworldly geometry. He has some terms for it that I won't try to pronounce. And it was just very fascinating and interesting how that story unfolds. And I really enjoyed that one too. Then there was The Thing on the Doorstep. This one just had a really basic premise. The narrator says, I had to kill one of my friends, but I trust me, I didn't murder him. And you're kind of thinking, how does that work? And so he goes through and explains his story about killing one of his friends. So that was a really interesting one. And then my favorite of all the Cthulhu stories, and maybe tied for Pickman's model overall in this collection, was The Whisperer in the Darkness. And this one probably had the most science fiction elements to it. That's probably why I liked it so much. And we had a character named Wilmarth, and he's corresponding with another guy named Akeley. And Akeley's telling him about all these weird things going on in this town and talking about aliens and all these weird things. And they're going back and forth with letters and whatnot. And they finally meet and things kind of escalate a bit. You get a bunch of real interesting things. I don't really want to spoil this one, but he kind of speculates how this newly discovered ninth planet Pluto could possibly be a homeworld for some aliens. We get some brains in boxes, and we get this really haunting scene. One of the scenes that have stuck with me the longest so far since reading this collection. And our main character, Wilmarth, it's like the middle of the night, and he's laying in bed, and he's clutching this revolver to his chest, and he's eavesdropping on this conversation between these aliens and these heads in boxes, and it's just really creepy. This was one that I listened to from Horror Babble, and the way he kind of voice acted out this scene was just done really well. And I really enjoyed this one. It was probably one of my favorites overall in this whole collection. So, you know, this was great. I'm glad I finally made it through some of these stories. Now I understand why people are drawn to Lovecraft's writing. And I can see the inspiration that tons of other authors have taken from him over the years. And now I can say I at least have got a taste of Lovecraft's work. You know, basically I've read everything that's in this collection. I may read some more in the future. If you know more about Lovecraft than I do, and you looked at the table of contents and you see something there that you think I would like, some other of his short stories, go ahead and recommend them to me. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.